In the vast and untamed heart of the African savanna, where the golden grasslands stretched beyond sight and the ancient baobab trees stood like silent sentinels of time, there lay a village hidden from the world. Zamoya was a place of deep-rooted traditions, where the elders spoke in proverbs and the spirits of the ancestors were honored with sacred rites. It was a village untouched by the hands of modernization, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the whispering winds and the shifting stars. That morning, the air carried a strange stillness, as if nature itself had paused in anticipation of something unseen. Birds that usually filled the sky with their melodic calls had grown silent. The goats, normally restless in their pens, stood frozen, ears twitching as if listening to something beyond human perception. A distant drumbeat echoed from the hills, though no one had touched the ceremonial drums that rested in the village's sacred grounds. Then, the deep and weathered voice of Bekazitha, the village elder, called through the dusty paths, summoning the people to the central gathering circle. His tone was urgent, a stark contrast to the measured wisdom he usually carried. His voice did not shake often, but today it did. "Something is coming," he said, standing at the center of the circle, his staff planted firmly into the ground. His eyes, milky with age, flickered with an unsettling intensity. "I've seen it in my visions." A murmur spread through the crowd. The people of Zamoya knew that Bekazitha's visions were never wrong. He was the keeper of the old ways, the bridge between the seen and the unseen. When he spoke, the people listened. Nafula, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper instincts, stepped forward. "What did you see, Bekazitha?" Her voice carried both respect and skepticism, but beneath it, there was fear. The old man exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his staff. "A visitor will come. He will not belong to this land, yet he will seek its secrets. He will ask questions that must not be answered. He will stand before the ones who are different." At those words, the energy in the gathering changed. People exchanged glances, their bodies tensing. No one needed to ask who he spoke of. They all knew, the Nfanda family. For generations, their bloodline had been whispered about in hushed voices. Each child born into their lineage carried 12 fingers, 6 on each hand, a feature that defied explanation. Some believed it was a gift from the gods, a sign that their family was chosen for something greater. Others feared it, whispering that the extra fingers were not a blessing, but a curse. "If a stranger comes looking for them, he comes looking for trouble," a voice muttered from the crowd. "What if he is not just a traveler?" another asked. Bekazitha closed his eyes, listening to the wind, as if waiting for an answer from something beyond. Then, a sharp gasp broke the silence. At the entrance of the village, standing beneath the towering acacia trees, was a man, tall and lean, with skin kissed by the sun and eyes filled with relentless curiosity. He carried the unmistakable presence of an outsider. His clothes were dusted with the marks of a long journey, and slung across his shoulder was a bag, heavy, worn, and filled with knowledge. Subari, the traveler, a seeker of truth, and perhaps an omen. His arrival sent an invisible ripple through the villagers, like a stone thrown into still water. Children clung to their mothers, men shifted their weight, and the elders observed him with unreadable expressions. For a long moment, Subari did not speak. He simply watched. Then finally he took a step forward. "I've come a long way to find Zamoya," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. "I've heard of a family unlike any other." A chill seemed to pass through the villagers, though the sun burned bright above them. Bekazitha's grip on his staff tightened. "Why do you seek them?" the elder asked, his tone measured. Subari met his gaze without hesitation. "Because their story has traveled far beyond these lands. Some say they were touched by gods. Others," he hesitated, choosing his next words carefully, "say they were marked by something else." A hush fell over the gathering. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, making the flames of the nearby fire dance wildly. "You ask dangerous questions, traveler," Bekazitha said at last. "And in Zamoya, some questions are better left unanswered." Zuberi took another step forward. "I need to know the truth." Bekazitha studied him for a long, silent moment. Then he turned his gaze to the villagers. Some looked afraid, others looked angry, and a few looked like they had been waiting for this moment. Then, without another word, the elder turned and began walking toward the outskirts of the village. "If you wish to know," he called back, "then follow me. But do not say I did not warn you." The path ahead was narrow, winding through the wild grass, leading toward a place untouched by time. A place where secrets had been buried for generations. A place where the Infanta family lived. As Zuberi took his first steps into the unknown, he could feel it. The air was different here, as if something or someone was watching. Zuberi was not just a traveler. He was a seeker of hidden truths, a man drawn to the shadows of history that others chose to ignore. Unlike scholars who relied on dusty books and distant theories, he pursued knowledge through experience, through the whispers of the wind and the stories buried in the minds of those who feared speaking them aloud. And among all the legends he had followed, none had consumed his thoughts as much as the mystery of the Infanta family, the bloodline of 12-fingered beings hidden deep within the village of Zamoya. For years, the tale had eluded him, always slipping through his grasp like grains of sand in the desert. Some called it folklore, others a divine blessing. But there were those who feared it, who spoke in hushed tones of things not meant for the ears of men. And if fear existed within a myth, then Zuberi knew there was truth buried beneath it. His journey had been long, stretching across endless savannas, through whispering forests and riverbeds that dried beneath the merciless sun. The people he met along the way spoke in riddles, warning him with old proverbs that chilled his bones. The lion that follows a ghost will find its own grave. Not all doors should be opened. Some hands are made for men, and others are not. Yet despite the unease in their voices, no one denied the existence of Infanta family. They merely refused to speak of it, and that, more than anything, convinced him he was close. Now, standing before the hut of Mazia, the matriarch of the family, Zuberi felt a tension unlike anything he had experienced before. The air around the small dwelling was thick, as if charged with an energy unseen, a pulse of something ancient and knowing. He had encountered many villages in his life, met countless people bound to their traditions. But this place felt different. The wind did not rustle the trees here. The birds did not call. It was as if the very earth was holding its breath. He took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding against his ribs. Then, without warning, the door creaked open. From the shadows within, Mazia emerged. Her presence was both commanding and unsettling, her frame draped in deep blue cloth, the fabric embroidered with golden symbols that seemed to move under the light. But it was not her garments that held Zuberi's gaze. It was her eyes, a piercing amber, burning with the weight of knowledge far beyond her years. They studied him, measured him, as if she already knew why he had come before he even spoke. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her hands. For a moment, Zuberi's breath hitched. He had prepared himself for this moment, had imagined it in 1,000 ways. Yet nothing could have readied him for the sight before him. 6 fingers on each hand, perfectly formed. Each digit moved with fluid precision, no deformity, no sign of mutation, just perfection in excess. The truth was undeniable. The legends were real. A cold shiver ran down his spine, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what this meant. This was not chance. This was not an accident of nature. This was something else. But before he could speak, before he could even begin to process what lay before him, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "You should not be here." Zuberi turned, his body tensing. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, his stance rigid, his expression unreadable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark skin glistening with a faint sheen of sweat. His eyes, much like Mazia's, held an intensity that made Zuberi's throat tighten. This was Sibu Siso, the eldest son of the family, and from the look in his gaze, he was not welcoming. Zuberi swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain calm. He had expected resistance, had known that this moment would not come easily. But there was something in Sibusiso's voice that sent a different kind of warning through him. Not just anger, but something else. Something like fear. "I come only for answers," Zuberi said, keeping his voice steady. "I mean no harm." Sibusiso took a slow step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You asked for answers to questions that should never be spoken." Mazia, still standing between them, did not move. Her expression remained unreadable, her amber eyes flickering between Zuberi and her son. But there was something in her face, a hesitation, a silent understanding. "You knew he would come," Sibusiso muttered, his voice low, edged with something dangerous. "You saw it, didn't you?" Mazia finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then softly she spoke. "The wind brings those who seek, whether we wish for them or not." Zuberi felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. This was not just a simple family secret. This was something greater, something woven into fate itself. "You should leave," Sibusiso said, his voice firmer now. "Go back to wherever you came from. This is not your place." Zuberi hesitated. He had come too far, seen too much to turn back now. But something about the way Sibusiso spoke, the way his fists trembled, the way his eyes darted to the edges of the trees. It was as if he expected something else to be watching. "I cannot leave without understanding," Zuberi said, though even as he spoke the words, doubt twisted in his gut. He had spent years chasing myths, unraveling old stories. But for the first time in his life, he was beginning to wonder if he had gone too far. Mazia sighed, her gaze shifting toward the distant hills, where the sky burned in hues of red and gold. Then, finally, she looked at him again. "If you wish to know the truth," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something ancient, "then you must be ready for the price that truth demands." A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending the leaves scattering around their feet. And in that moment, Zuberi knew he was standing on the edge of something far greater than he had imagined. And whatever secrets lay ahead, they were not meant for the faint of heart. Zuberi knew from the moment he stepped into Zamoya that gaining the trust of the Nfanda family would not be easy. The weight of secrecy hung thick in the air, pressing against his chest like an unseen force. Yet, despite the cold reception, despite Sibusiso's unspoken warnings, he refused to turn back. He had not crossed miles of scorching desert, nor traced whispers through forgotten villages, just to be sent away without answers. "I don't mean harm," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to understand." For a moment, there was silence. Then Mazia, the matriarch of the family, took a slow step forward. Her amber eyes locked onto his, searching. There was something unsettling in the way she studied him, as if she were peeling back the layers of his soul, weighing his very existence against something unseen. Finally, she gave a single nod. "Then you must listen," she said, her voice carrying the weight of an ancient warning. "But you must never speak of this outside our land." The way she said it sent a ripple through Zuberi's spine. He had chased many myths, many legends, but never had he been told such words with such finality. He could feel the gravity of the secret, pressing down on the very air around them. Without another word, Mazia turned and motioned for him to follow. The hut was larger than it appeared from the outside. As he stepped in, the first thing he noticed was the carvings. They stretched across the walls in intricate, swirling patterns, symbols unlike anything he had ever seen before. Some seemed almost familiar, resembling ancient markings found in civilizations long gone. Others made his stomach churn, as if his mind could not fully grasp their meaning. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, the kind used in rituals older than time itself. The flickering flames from a small clay lamp cast shifting shadows across the carvings, making them seem almost alive. At the center of the room, resting on a platform of dark stone, was a tablet. Zuberi's breath caught in his throat. Its surface was worn, yet the engravings remained clear. The symbols upon it pulsed with an energy he could not explain. They did not belong to any known writing system, yet something deep within him recognized them. "This," Mazia said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is why we are different." She gestured to the stone, her six-fingered hands running over its surface with reverence. It holds the story of our ancestors. Zuberi stepped closer, his heart pounding. He had spent years deciphering the remnants of forgotten histories, but nothing had prepared him for this. He traced the symbols with his fingers, feeling the cold stone beneath his touch. And then something clicked. His mind raced, sifting through years of study, of lost civilizations, of whispers of ancient bloodlines. Some of these symbols, they were similar to markings found thousands of miles away, in ruins untouched for centuries. Symbols that had no known origin. Could it be possible? Could the Nthanda family's lineage be far older than anyone had ever imagined? Before he could voice his thoughts, a sudden force slammed the door shut. Zuberi spun around, his pulse hammering. Sibusiso stood there, his body rigid, his expression dark. "They are watching," he said, his voice edged with something beyond anger, beyond fear. Zuberi frowned. Who was watching? Sibusiso's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered toward Maziya, as if silently urging her to say nothing. But the matriarch did not move, her gaze fixed on the tablet. Finally, Sibusiso exhaled sharply. "The ones who cursed us." The words hung in the air like a looming storm. Zuberi felt the weight of them settle in his chest. This was not just about an unusual bloodline. This was not a simple case of genetics or mutation. There was something else at play, something far older, something unseen. He had come seeking truth. But now, standing in the flickering firelight, surrounded by ancient markings and voices that spoke in riddles, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know it anymore. The fire crackled softly, its embers glowing like dying stars against the vast darkness of the African night. The scent of burning wood mixed with the faint aroma of wild herbs that Maziya had tossed into the flames, a tradition meant to keep away the spirits of the restless. Shadows danced across the ground, stretching and twisting like silent whispers of the past. Zuberi sat among them, his body warmed by the flames, but his mind consumed by something colder. The tablet, the symbols, the unspoken warnings. Everything pointed to something far beyond what he had expected. He had come seeking a story of lineage, of mystery, perhaps even of exile. But the weight in the air, the way the villagers avoided speaking of the Nthanda family, told him that what he had found was something else entirely. Across from him, Maziya sat with her hands resting on her knees, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight with an eerie glow. Sibusiso was tense beside her, his fists clenched, his gaze fixed on the flames, as if willing them to consume the past before the words could be spoken. But the past had a way of surviving. It lingered in blood, in bones, in the whispers carried by the wind. Maziya exhaled slowly before speaking, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Long ago," she began, "our ancestors were no different from the others. We lived, we loved, we died, just as all men do. Our hands had 5 fingers. Our lives followed the cycle that was written for all who walk this earth." Her eyes flickered upward for a brief moment, until the visitors came. Zuberi straightened slightly, his pulse quickening. There was something in her tone, something different. He had expected folklore, a story twisted by generations. But this was not the voice of a storyteller. This was the voice of someone who had carried a truth too heavy for too long. "Visitors?" he asked, his throat suddenly dry. Maziya's gaze locked onto his, and in that moment he felt it. The shift, the turning of something unseen, something that had been waiting in the silence. They were not of this earth. A heavy stillness followed. Even the fires seemed to dim, as if the very air had absorbed the weight of her words. Zuberi felt a chill creep into his bones. He had heard many tales, sat before many elders who spoke of spirits, gods, curses. But this was different. This was not metaphor. This was history. "They chose our bloodline," Maziya continued, her voice steady but edged with something almost like sorrow. "They marked us, changed us, and left us with knowledge no other humans should possess." Zuberi's mind raced. Every fiber of logic told him this was impossible, that what she was suggesting defied reason. And yet, here they were, sitting before a woman whose family had carried 12 fingers for generations. Something so rare, so precise, that it could not be dismissed as mere chance. "What kind of knowledge?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, Mzia hesitated. Sibusiso's fist tightened. He did not look at Zuberi when he spoke. "A knowledge we should have never received," he said, his voice dark, bitter. "A knowledge that was not meant for man." Mzia did not deny it. Instead, she reached into the folds of her garments and withdrew something wrapped in aged cloth. Slowly, carefully, she unwrapped it, revealing a small, metallic fragment. It was unlike anything Zuberi had ever seen. The surface was smooth, flawless, reflecting the firelight with an unnatural brilliance. Strange inscriptions ran along its edges, symbols almost identical to the ones he had seen on the stone tablet. But the material, it was not from this world. He could feel it. Mzia watched him carefully. "They did not come to bless us," she said. "They came to change us, to make us different, to make us theirs." A silence stretched between them, thick and unbreakable. "But why?" Zuberi finally asked. Sibusiso exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We were never meant to ask that question." Zuberi's mind was spinning. If they had been chosen, why were they hiding? Why had they been left behind? And what was this price Mzia had spoken of? He looked up, searching for the answer in her face. Mzia's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because they will return." Zuberi's breath caught in his throat. Outside, the wind held, carrying the echoes of something ancient, something that had never truly left. Night had fallen, but Zuberi's mind refused to rest. The weight of what he had learned pressed against his thoughts, unraveling every assumption he had ever made about the world. The Nthana family had not always been this way. They had been changed, marked, chosen. By whom, or by what, was a question that clawed at him, demanding answers. Was it all just folklore, the kind of tale that villages wove to explain the unexplainable? Or was there something real behind their fear? He lay awake on the mat Mzia had provided, staring at the woven ceiling of the hut, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the village beyond the walls. The air was thick, heavier than before, as if the earth itself was bracing for something. And then the sound came. At first, it was distant, a low, rhythmic pounding. Slow, deliberate, it echoed through the hills beyond Zamoya, a deep, primal beat that rattled through his chest. The drums, they did not come from human hands. Not tonight. Zuberi sat up, his pulse spiking. The pounding grew louder, rippling through the ground like the pulse of something awakening. He stepped outside, and his breath hitched. The villagers had already gathered, standing in clusters near the fire pits. They did not speak. They did not move. Their faces were pale with something beyond fear, a knowing dread. They had heard this before, and whatever followed it was never good. Zuberi followed their gazes to the distant hills. And then he saw it, a light, floating, pulsing, moving toward them. It was no torch, no fire. It hovered unnaturally above the horizon, shifting between hues of blue and gold, casting shadows that twisted in ways that made no sense. It was silent, yet the air around it vibrated with something unseen, something that sent a primal warning deep into his bones. Beside him, Mzia whispered. Though the words were barely audible, they carried the weight of something inevitable. "They are coming." Zuberi's breath came shallow. He wanted to ask who, but deep down he already knew. His heart pounded as he stepped forward. His mind screamed for reason, for logic, for something to explain what his eyes were seeing. But there was no explanation. This was not folklore. This was real, and they had returned. A sudden, crushing grip locked around his arm. "You must leave. Now." Sibusiso's voice was raw with desperation. His fingers dug in his Zuberi's skin, as if trying to physically pull him away from the truth. "No." Zuberi yanked his arm free. "I need to know." Sibusiso's expression contorted, torn between fury and something that looked dangerously close to pleading. "The truth is not for you." His voice cracked, the weight of generations behind his words. "You think knowledge is a gift, but it is a burden. We were never meant to understand." Zuberi shook his head. He had spent his entire life chasing the unknown, pushing past warnings and superstition. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Before he could speak, the sky ripped open with light. It was blinding, unnatural, a burst of radiance so intense it burned through his vision even as he shut his eyes. A deafening silence followed, the kind that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something too vast, too incomprehensible to be heard. And then it began, a low hum, a vibration that crawled into his chest, through his ribs, into his very bones. The villagers dropped to their knees, some covering their ears, others whispering prayers to gods who could no longer help them. Mzia stood motionless, her gaze locked on the sky, waiting. Sibusiso turned back to Zuberi, his eyes wide, frantic. But beneath the terror, there was acceptance. You shouldn't have come. His voice was barely audible over the hum. Zuberi's mind reeled, every fiber of his being screaming for him to run. But he couldn't, because in that moment he understood the Nthanda family had not been chosen. They'd been claimed, and now, after all these years, the secret had come back to take them. By dawn, Zuberi stood alone. The air was still, heavy with the kind of silence that felt unnatural, almost deliberate. The Nthanda family was gone. No signs of struggle, no hurried footprints in the dirt, no broken objects to suggest an escape, just emptiness, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole, erasing any trace of their existence. It was as if they had never been there. The village was different now. It moved like a body without a soul, a place where the people existed but did not live. The morning fire pits burned as usual. Women gathered water from the well, their hands steady but their eyes vacant. Children who had once laughed and played now clung to their mothers in silence. The men sharpened their blades, tended to the cattle, did what was necessary, but there was no conversation. No one spoke of what had happened. Zuberi searched for answers. He stopped an elder, a man whose face had once been kind, but now held only shadowed eyes. Mzia, Sibusiso, where are they? The man did not answer. His gaze flickered, just for a second, to the hills beyond the village. The same hills where the light had burned the sky the night before. Then he turned and walked away. Zuberi moved from one villager to another, desperation creeping into his voice, into his thoughts. No one would meet his eyes. No one acknowledged the names he spoke. It was as if they had never existed. Denial. That was the only way to survive in Zamoya. Pretend. Erase. Ignore. But Zuberi could not ignore what he had seen. He retraced his steps to where Mzia's home had stood, or where it should have been. His breath caught in his throat. There was nothing there. No structure, no ashes, no scattered belongings. Only undisturbed earth, smooth and untouched, as if no human feet had walked that ground in years. That was impossible. Zuberi knelt, running his fingers through the dirt. Cold, too cold for the rising sun. His pulse pounded as his hands dug deeper, clawing at the earth, searching for proof that they had been here. But they had lived. Then his fingers brushed against something solid. He stilled. Carefully, he unearthed it, brushing away layers of dust and time. A stone tablet. His breath came short and fast. He had seen this before, inside Mzia's hut. It had been intact then, its carvings deep and deliberate, preserving the history of a family that should not have existed. But now it was broken. A deep, jagged crack split its surface, running through its center like a wound that could never heal. The symbols were worn, their edges faded as if time had devoured them overnight. Something had tried to erase this, but one message remained. A single line, unbroken, clear, a warning. They will return when the time is right. Zuberi's fingers trembled as he traced the words. His mind spun, racing back to every hushed whisper, every half-spoken warning. We were never meant to speak of this. The ones who cursed us, because they will return. A sudden, horrifying realization gripped him. This was not the first time. The Nthanda family had not simply disappeared. They'd been taken, and this had happened before. How many times? How many generations have lived in silence, knowing that one day they would be erased, that their lineage, their history, their very existence would be plucked from the world as if it had never been? Was this the price of their knowledge? Was this the price of being chosen? A gust of wind rushed through the empty space, lifting the dust and sending it swirling into the morning air. It whispered through the trees, through the silent village, through the empty space where a home had once stood. Zibri looked up at the sky. The dawn was soft, almost beautiful. The sun painted the horizon in strokes of orange and gold, as if the world was completely untouched by the horror of the night before. Too peaceful, too perfect, as if nothing had happened, as if it was meant to be forgotten. But Zibri knew, he knew, the legend was far from over. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.